Why, hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. We got a special show today. One of our members is not here. Glenn Sunshine is on the road, but we have someone to fill in for him, and this special guest is a real treat for us to have on the show. But before we talk to him and let him introduce himself, let me just remind everybody, I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest. I taught philosophy for about a decade at the college level. I've been a real estate investor and have done some writing, and my latest book is In the House of Tom Bombadil. Okay, Tom.
I'm Tom Price. I teach systematic theology, Christian ethics, philosophy, and a few other things. One of the places is at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
And we've got on the show today an old friend, Ken Myers of Mars Hill Audio. And Ken and I have been together a few times, and we have a mutual friend, John Sundet, who listens to our show regularly back in Connecticut. And anyway, he was the person that got us to meet each other in person years back. But Ken, tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe give our listeners a little intro to what Mars Hill Audio is about, because that's the theme of today's show.
Yeah. First of all, I'm living in Central Virginia near Charlottesville, Virginia. We've lived in Central Virginia since 1988. I'm an East Coast native. Mars Hill Audio is my main job. I'm host and producer, and we do interviews with guests about questions in culture, looking at culture theologically and practically. Often, when I try to summarize what we're about, I say that we're trying to build a better understanding of what's distinctively problematic with the culture of modernity, with modern culture, which requires some thinking about culture more generally and a lot of historical material. But then I'm also interested in asking questions about what would our cultural lives look like if they were more fully informed by a Christian understanding of reality. And so all of my guests, that's the ultimate aim. Now, obviously, not everybody I interview talks about those things specifically. Some people I interview don't even know that's what I'm interested in learning about. Some of my guests aren't Christians. I've interviewed, but if they have a particularly helpful understanding of some aspect of this bigger project, then I've done a lot of those interviews. I've been doing it for 30 years. I started my broadcasting career actually in college. I did college radio, everything from classical music to live radio drama to a Christian radio program at my secular campus station. I'm sure I wouldn't be allowed to do what I did back in the early 70s in college today at a state university. Shortly after college, I went to work for National Public Radio, and that was where I really got most of my significant training in doing this kind of work. So that's what I do. Actually, might not hurt to mention a few other lines on my resume. After NPR, I worked for a couple of years just about a year with Chuck Colson. I helped him write a book. I worked for 2 years with Richard John Newhouse on the quarterly periodical, which was the predecessor to First Things, magazine called This World. And then spent about 7 years trying to figure out. I had a couple of freelance jobs and a couple of consulting jobs. I wanted to launch a new periodical, and I thought a new magazine was a great idea. A new print magazine at a time when who knew that print was just about to die?
Right.
But I had worked in audio, and I had a strange experience in about 1990. I had four very different people from very different spheres of my experience, suggest that I think about getting back into audio.
Wow.
And when the fourth person told me that, I thought, God must be trying to tell me something.
Right.
Because I had been out of audio production for a long time. And so I thought, well, what might that look like? And I actually put together a proposal to do a a weekly arts and humanities magazine for NPR. My job at NPR, I was arts and humanities editor for Morning Edition. I had done other arts programming prior to that. And then actually was editor of a 5-hour arts magazine and performance program before I left there in 1983. So 1990, people are saying, Ken, you ought to think about getting back into audio. And I thought, well, what would that look like? I put together a proposal for a program that would look at arts and humanities issues from a covertly Christian understanding of reality. And I went to 25 foundations to try to get funding to do this show. I basically said conservatives and Christians complain about media bias. Instead of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on another conference on the problem of media bias, would you give me a lot less money than that to actually do something that was biased in a direction that we like? And when the 25th rejection letter came back, I realized God was trying to tell me something.
Well, this is a remarkable thing to consider, because as I think about, the work of Marcel Audio, I'm kind of an early adopter. I was introduced to the show by Kent Hill. I don't know if you remember Kent.
Oh, yeah.
But Kent, he said, you got to check out this thing. This is like mid-'90s, so you're just still in the tapes in those days. So I became a subscriber back then. I thought, this is great. I mean, this is like the NPR of Christian radio. This is what, like when I turn on Christian radio, this is what I really want, I never get.
Exactly.
So what I didn't tell you about my resume, a little secret. So for about 2 years, I worked in the early 70s for a Christian radio program, a Christian radio station. Back before there was CCM, but they were kind of starting to do kind of Christian pop stuff. But I was doing some pretty innovative things on this program involving poetry and reading aloud and all sorts of things. And that's the only job from which I've ever been fired. And when the station manager brought me into his office to fire me, he said, and I quote, "You're too creative to work in Christian radio."
Oh, no.
And I said, well, at least we agree on something. In fact, there was a time when I thought maybe that could be on my tombstone. He was too creative for Christian radio. But
what an indictment. That's a
like
great story.
A year later, I was working at NPR.
Yeah, that's right.
So then fast forward to 1990, when I thought about doing an arts and magazine show, an NPR-like program. Originally, I thought I could get it placed on enough NPR member stations to make it worthwhile. And I thought, well, this would be a way of kind of doing something really subversive within that system. A number of people said, well, why don't you try to get it on Christian radio? And I said, well, I don't think Christian radio is interested in it. And I did a little bit of exploration. And here's a really interesting, I don't know, this is kind of off.
Oh, this is great stuff. Let's talk about it.
It's telling, very telling.
You didn't plan on talking what's wrong with Christian radio. But, what I realized, I actually was in conversation with a couple of the larger Christian networks, as well as some individual stations. And what I realized is that almost all programming on Christian radio stations are effectively following the model of the infomercial. That is, program producers buy airtime. Whereas in NPR, stations buy programs. And it's a totally different, the cash flows in exactly the opposite way. And so with public radio, nobody can just buy time on a public radio station. You basically produce a program, you find some underwriting to do the production, but a lot of the programs are underwritten by the fees that are paid either by NPR or by the individual stations. And that's when I realized that one of the reasons why Christian radio was so superficial and hysterical was that the Christian radio programs were in effect just a infomercial to raise money for themselves or for some other ministry. And in order to get people to give money, I mean, imagine if Garrison Keillor had to raise money every week back when he was doing Prairie Home Companion.
Right.
Yeah. And basically, if the program's survival depended on a sense of urgency in fundraising, the quality of the program would be different.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's when I realized that Christian radio wasn't an option. Getting Christian and conservative foundations to support a program on NPR didn't seem to be an option. So I thought, well, in fact, you can hear this on the pilot that I produced in 1992, 30 years ago. I said in the script for that pilot that my intention was, I was still trying to get a radio program, but I'd thought, wouldn't it be interesting if I had a weekly program, wouldn't it be interesting to put together an audio cassette with the greatest hits, and every month we'd take the best material, and this would be another source of income, another revenue stream. People would subscribe and get a cassette with, here's the best stuff that was heard on this program that Ken Myers hosts. And so the pilot was originally intended to be, here's what that greatest hits cassette would sound like. I didn't plan on doing an audio magazine at the time. I thought that what became the Mars Hill tapes was going to be the tapes from the Mars Hill audio radio program. But by early 1993, I realized the radio program wasn't going to happen. So then I thought, could we just do an audio periodical? And I thought, what a crazy idea. At the time, I'd been editing a small desktop publishing newsletter that went to about 400 subscribers, which was a way for me to keep my finger in some kind of editorial work after I left the magazines I'd worked for. I didn't mention I worked for 2 years as editor of Eternity magazine. I forgot that.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was where I really developed my concern for how do Christians think about culture. Because I spent 7 or 8 years working with NPR, and I knew how the culture thought about Christians.
well, our listeners, I think, if they're not already aware of Mars Hill Audio, are really the kind of people that would benefit from it. So one of the things you've got now is an app. And
right.
So if you're listening right now out there in podcast land, you really ought to go to your phone and just look for the Mars Hill Audio app, download it. And there's a feature that you do every Friday, which is, for anyone, it's there's no paywall or anything. Yeah. But it gives you a little sample of what, you're up to. And I encourage people to, do that. There's, like I said, no cost barrier. But then I bet if you've listened to 2 or 3 of these interviews on the Friday feature, you'll say, I want the Mars Hill Audio Journal. Yeah. And some of the people that you have on the show, we've had on our show, like Jason Baxter, I noticed this last issue.
He's on the current volume of the journal, by the way.
Yeah. We had a great time with him, and I listened to your interview with him because I just been listening to the latest journal. So as we think about how the Mars Hill sort of world has developed and grown, what are some things that maybe we've not mentioned yet that you'd like for folks to know about?
I think I could say. In terms of things that I've learned in doing it, I mean, I've learned how to be a better interviewer. I did a lot of interviews when I was at NPR. I mean, actually, my first interview 50 years ago this fall, I did my very first interview with Johnny Cash. Oh, and it's been downhill since then. I peaked early. I was 19 years old, and I interviewed Johnny Cash, and that was my very first interview I did. And then I did a lot of interviews at NPR for Morning Edition. And then I didn't do interviews for a long time, and I started doing interviews again in 92 when I launched Mars Hill Audio. And I've learned a lot about how conversation works. And one of the things that, in fact, early on, we were a couple of years into it when one of my board members said that he thought that what Mars Hill Audio did was less provide answers and more an ambience. that it provided at the time, talk radio was the thing.
Yeah.
And talk radio was scream radio for the most part.
Right.
But the idea of a thoughtful, intelligent conversation, which was what we really encouraged at NPR. I mean, when I did interviews at NPR, one of my favorite interviews I did while I was at Morning Edition was with the novelist P.D. James, for instance.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. Yeah.
And I talked to her for an hour, but then the feature got edited down to 7 minutes or so when it appeared on Morning Edition. But so the idea, and that's one of the things I learned from NPR generally, was how to engage someone in a real conversation, not just grilling them or interrogating them.
Right.
Yeah. And I've come to I many years after I'd been doing this for a while, I read an essay by Joseph Pieper, who said truth lives in conversation.
Yeah.
And I remember for a minute I was disappointed because I thought surely truth lives in books. That's why I've been collecting so many of them.
Yeah, we can see them in the back there.
Yeah, there are a few of them in the background. But the idea that truth lives in conversation, and then I read an essay by Robert Jensen about he wrote a number of essays about the history of higher education and kind of a theology of higher education. And he points out that the modern Western university, was founded not so much to promote the pursuit of truth, but to promote the pursuit of conversation about the truth.
Oh, wow. Well, this is very sort of like, Plato and dialectic. And,
He said, you can pursue truth by yourself.
Yeah.
But to pursue truth in conversation and in argument, in fact, but with the end, not argument so that you can kind of win, not argument so that you can beat down your opponent and show how much smarter than he is you are, but argument for the sake of actually earnestly striving together to figure out what is true. So that's something that I may have intuited when I started, but something I've come to appreciate, and that's why. It's interesting to see because again, I started before there were podcasts. I've said before that someone said I invented the podcast before there were iPods.
Right.
And because of the fact that radio, I mean, there was possibility of conversation on talk radio when you got callers, but typically the way the callers were treated and the kind of platform for ostentatious, delivery of one's opinion. And the other thing, the idea that every opinion is as good as any other opinion, it kind of works against the idea of conversation for the pursuit of truth. So,
I'd like to zero in on that a little bit, Ken, because you've been doing this for a while, and you got into this because you had a set of concerns, and this led to a series of conversations. And before we started recording, you mentioned that your thinking has changed over the years because of these conversations.
Yeah.
So when you first jumped into this, what were the things that you were hoping to learn about, and what were you thinking, and what's happened, and where are you now?
Right. Well, let me go back a little ways because as I've thought about this. Having this conversation, figure out how do I explain myself. I realized that I've been curious from the time I was a freshman in college, if not earlier, about how cultural change happens. I started college in 1970. It was the year right before I started college. 4 students were killed at Kent State University by National Guardsmen in protests against Vietnam. It was a pretty tempestuous time. We're living in a tempestuous time now. The nature of the tempestuousness is a little bit different, but it's not entirely novel. And I remember one of the first lectures I went to, it was an open lecture at the University of Maryland when I was a freshman. It was right before classes started. It was with William Kunstler, who was one of the lawyers who defended, I think it was the Chicago 7 or one of the radical groups. And he kept saying, when the revolution comes, when the revolution comes, and he kept talking about, how we were going to overthrow the American establishment. And I was a nice Christian, nice evangelical boy, never smoked, never drank. And suddenly they're talking about, blowing up the White House or something. And
you grew up in the Christian Missionary Alliance, is that right?
My parents were both from the Christian Missionary Alliance, but when I was about fifth or sixth grade, they started attending a Presbyterian church, an evangelical Presbyterian church, but very conservative. So I was trying to figure out, how did we get here? I remember thinking, how did we get here?
Yeah.
And then I had an interest in the arts. I sang in some remarkable choirs in high school with some amazing teachers. I won't give you all the details, but I just was astonished. And I was aware of the fact that there was this incredible history of particularly sacred choral music. I was singing Palestrina and Bach and then composers into the 20th century. But I was wondering why music of that caliber wasn't being heard even in the early 70s in a lot of churches. What happened where I was even aware in college that we were kind of dumbing down the experience, the aesthetic side of liturgies. And so I was just curious about that. Not so much for theological reasons, partly, but also I just wanted to know how it happened. So that was an interest I had. And then in 1975, I was out of college for a year or so. I went to work at NPR, and suddenly I'm in a very post-Christian space. And I was trying to figure out, why does the people I worked with, for the most part, looked at the world differently than I did. Some of them came from fairly conventional backgrounds. Some of them had grown up with some kind of church membership or activity. But by the time I got there were all sorts of what I thought of as exotic worldviews. And I was trying to figure out, well, why do these people think their way of looking at the world is plausible? What is it about their experience? And I discovered, while I was working there, the work of Peter Berger, right, and his idea, what he calls plausibility structures.
Right.
And Berger points out that our view of the world is made plausible by the experience in everyday life of all sorts of things. That doesn't come to us as a package of theories, comes to us as practices, but the practices contain within them an implicit way of a kind of posture toward the world. And so that was, again, I discovered his work while I was at NPR trying to figure it out. And I actually left NPR after just a few years to go to seminary, because I thought, okay, I've come out of a very strong church experience, good Christian ed programs, Christian parents, extended family, most of whom are committed Christians, 3 uncles who are missionaries. If I'm having trouble understanding what's going on around me, then most laymen are having trouble understanding.
Yeah. So the seminary you went to, of course, was the seminary that you got to know John Sundet at and Peter Leithart at, and that's Westminster in Philadelphia.
Right. Yeah. And so I quit after 3 years, not intending to go back to NPR. And I intended to go on and pursue some kind of teaching ministry, either as part of a church staff or in a study center or in something. And studied at Westminster Reformed Theology, and did just a 2-year program. Couldn't find anybody to hire me to do what I thought I was equipped to do, what I thought should be done. And while I was looking for a job, an old friend was the executive producer of Morning Edition, and he invited me to come back to NPR as arts editor for Morning Edition when it went on the air in 1979. And I thought, well, I hadn't planned on this, but...
Now, I want to ask, has Westminster ever come to you and said, hey, we want to demonstrate that, we're kind of, a cutting edge institution. We have Ken Myers as one of our alum.
Huh. No, I haven't. In fact, I realized after I'd started Mars Hill and was doing this that this may be a little snarky. You may have to edit this out.
No, we like snarky. Give us snarky.
I didn't fit I wasn't Tim Keller, basically. So it was. I was never really, chagrined by it. But I thought, even when I was at Westminster, I thought Westminster had committed itself to training pastors, which is a great thing to do. But I remember thinking at the time that, there are all these divinity schools in the UK and in the US that are as committed to training scholars as training pastors. And I thought if the conservative seminaries in this country aren't committed to training scholars, then we're not going to have the kind of theological resources we need to train pastors. Let me tell you another story that may illustrate a weakness in American Christianity that's related to this. Years ago, I met Frank Brock, who was then the president of Covenant College, the PCA's college, and of course, some relationship with Covenant Seminary. But Frank, he had been a successful businessman who came to work as president of this college, and he and I got to talk for an hour or so, and he said one of the things that disappointed him as president, he was getting ready to quit. He said he'd go out to presbytery meetings and speak to do fundraising for Covenant College. And he would speak to these clergy for the most part and try to get their churches to put Covenant College on their budget, to donate to the school as part of their regular budget. And he said, I had my stump talk where I would say, imagine how wonderful it would be if you had graduates from Covenant College who were members of your congregation. That meant that you had lawyers in your congregation who'd thought about a Christian understanding of law. You had teachers in your congregation who'd thought about education from within a Christian framework. You'd had scientists who were doing research thinking about a Christian framework. And he went on and, he thought, well, wouldn't this be a gloriously enriching thing for your congregation? And he said maybe 10% of the clergy thought that was a good idea. Wow. And I said, why do you think otherwise? He said most of the clergy felt threatened by it, and they felt that if there was a study group getting together to talk about theology and law, then those people wouldn't come to the pastor's 15-part series on the minor prophets. So in other words, thinking about the culture was viewed, as Frank saw it, and this is a point of view of a layman, interesting. That a lot of the clergy saw any effort that lay people gave to thinking theologically about cultural life would in some way compromise or threaten the pure theology, the unapplied theology that the pastor was equipped to provide. And I thought, well, that's very telling.
Yeah, Tom.
Just to add to that, I found something very similar when I came out of my training. I started out sort of in a confessional Baptist world, and you had your pure theologians, very safe, but very, only touched on a range of things, and they knew exactly enough about some of the wider theology to know why we shouldn't read them. And it was actually studying under, I went to Duke Divinity I had figures like Reinhard Hutter, I had David Steinmetz, and just a whole host that really opened the what you would call the larger Christian conversation, and how rigorously people are serious about bringing the Christian light into every sphere of life from different angles. But when I go back into kind of the world's a lot of the pocket worlds of the evangelicals, a lot of times there is this suspicion that all of a sudden you've compromised some purity if you've read, Gregory of Nyssa or something. And it is frustrating. And so I imagine you've bumped up against it enough with your show in the Word.
Well, so Tuesday I interviewed Mark Knoll about his most recent book called America's Book, which is a big book on a history of the Bible in American culture from about 1789 to 1911 is and is kind of a cutoff point where he believes that you begin to see the radical decline of the influence of Scripture as a public document, as a voice in American culture. Right. And one of the things we talked about was Mark, I don't know if you know his work, but he's written quite a bit about the perplexing problem of Christians and slavery in America, and how the fact that you had Christians talking about the importance of Bible and living in accordance with the Word, and in the mid 19th century, half of them used the Bible to defend slavery, and half of them used the Bible to oppose slavery. Not half and half, but he's often raised the question, if we can't even figure out what the biblical teaching means with regard to slavery, then what role does the Scripture actually have for us? But then in our conversation and in this most recent book, he points out that when Christian commitment has been allied with various causes, let's call them that, like pro-slavery or abolition, that often the cause kind of takes over, and the question of Christian faithfulness and conviction, it's easy for Christian commitments to become instrumentally used to support the cause, rather than for the cause to be expressions of a deep and rich Christian commitment. And we talked about how part of that's probably because of the fact that when you take the consequences of the gospel out into public, we end up necessarily building institutions that will take that understanding and activate it. And there's always the dilemma of the institutions and a social cause or political cause regarding the gospel just as a tool to build this other cause. And that's I think that especially happens when the causes are not tied closely to the life of the church, when they become parachurch causes. And so I think part of the challenge in modernity, modernity doesn't just privatize religion. Modernity marginalizes the church. This is a big point that Peter Leithart has made. And so most Christians who believe that there are consequences of the gospel out in the world can't imagine how the church could actually reflect that. We've relegated the church to the church is just another parachurch organization. That's right. The church is all about helping individual believers either just get saved or stay saved, grow in Christ. But the idea that the church would be a presence in the world, that makes a lot of people nervous. So I think that's I think that's a. But back to Mark Knoll again for a second, because the point he made, he said that he talked a lot about the 19th century Methodism and Francis Asbury. Yeah. And he says that Asbury wasn't that concerned about social issues. He wanted to build strong churches, strong Christian commitments, and avoided, in a sense, the public ramifications. And so I asked Mark, I said, does this mean that within modernity, it's much easier to be a dualistic Christian, to assume that we have our faith over here that has nothing to do with public life, and we have public life out here which has nothing to do with faith. It's much easier to live as a Christian with that kind of dualistic understanding than it is to actually have an integrated understanding of faith and life.
Yeah, this gets it's reflected in many sort of things that we don't even note. For example, when we think about the old New England town green and the white clapboard Congregational Church, well, most of those churches were, established during the colonial era when the church really was the center of community life, and they were referred to as meeting houses. Today, the cool thing to do is to get the warehouse on the outside of town, and turn it into a smoke and light show.
Right. Well, yeah. So anyway, so that's the question of that dualism, and this gets back to the point that Frank Brock is making, that the pastors, in his experience, were in a sense accentuating that dualism. They knew how to give lectures on, the 5 points of Calvinism or the minor prophets or whatever, but the idea of a Christian understanding of law or a Christian understanding of the meaning of education, that's not in their job description. And I've had conversations with clergy about this, and I've had conversations with clergy who are having trouble in their congregation, troubles which were almost predictable symptoms of some kind of captivity to some dimension of modern culture. And the pastor was kind of oblivious. The pastor tends to think it's just this, it's just these three guys in my church who are causing problems. And I've said, those three guys are acting entirely consistently with some pattern of life in the culture around them. You need to understand the culture better. And the response is, oh no, my job is to preach the gospel. I don't need to understand the culture that well, I need to understand the culture so I can market my message better. So it's market research. That's helpful. But the bigger dynamics are typically not understood. Now, you ask about ways my thinking has changed. I should, before we run out of time or the software dies, I should say, early on when I started, I still did have a kind of dualism that I didn't think I did, but I did. And the way I would say is that I tended to look at theological convictions about creation and the meaning of redemption and all sorts of other things as providing, in a sense, a motivational platform for being active as a believer in the world. But I didn't really think that one's specific theological commitments actually had consequences for how we lived in the world in a thick way. And I remember saying to someone early on that basically the theology provides the platform or the motivation, but then we need good social science and we need the critical work, analytical work to help us navigate. The idea that actually we also need more theological resources and better theological resources to develop the understanding, not just to provide the motivation for us going out and then becoming effectively secular as we examine the culture. So that's been a big change. And I also thought that again, in my theological training, and here I'll say something about what I think is a weakness in the Reformed world. Historically, the Reformed world, for the most part, has tended to be kind of nervous about metaphysics. I use the M word. Just use the word.
That's right. We've experienced that.
Yeah. Well,
even this week.
So here's an example that comes to mind. I have a book somewhere back there on Jonathan Edwards and the Trinity. And the foreword to the book says that Edwards had written a lot of short works on Trinitarian theology that were never published because he was nervous that a lot of his Reformed contemporaries would be suspicious because he wasn't simply deducing something from Scripture.
Gotcha.
He was basically offering, and this is what I think the church did for 1,500 years. I think this is what the church does in the Nicene Creed, when we say that the Son is of one substance with the Father. That's not deduced from Scripture. However, the story and the claims that are made about Christ in Scripture require some kind of adequate philosophical platform within which they can be understood. But the platform itself isn't entirely deducible from Scripture. Yeah. And now that's something that in the 16th century and specifically, I think, in the 17th century, as much under the influence of 17th century rationalism, that's something that Reformed people got really nervous about. And the whole idea of sola scriptura means that we don't need philosophy or philosophy and philosophical. It's just carnal speculation.
The weird thing about that, Ken, is I've seen biblicism used in a kind of reducing or a reductive way, so as to say, well, since the Scriptures don't explicitly address this, then we're all free to do whatever we want.
Well, and again, the Scriptures don't explicitly address transgenderism.
Right. That's a good example. Right. Yeah,
I was going to make a quick point. I mean, a lot of the work that I'm doing is around this issue, and so again, we see the suspiciousness, especially out of certain camps, that if you don't follow their one particular pure figure in their kind of pure Reformed theology, if you will, that somehow you've compromised. But I think one of the things of studying the history of the church and the history of theology, the patristics, a lot of the medieval thinkers, and the assumptions of the early Reformation and post-Reformation scholastics, is how immersed and how they lacked that nervousness about engaging in those things, because they didn't work with the competitiveness between transcendence and the creation, because they understood these things in a radically different way. And I have tried, episode after episode, to kind of get that proper way of understanding transcendence and creation, so that the creation, of course, is always dependent on the creator to be, right? But that doesn't mean, therefore, that it when it enacts itself, it's somehow no longer dependent on the creator to be.
Right.
And so if I do something and use my intelligence, I'm as dependent on the creator for using my intelligence, but I'm also using my intelligence, and it's not in competition, but it can be ordered the right way or disordered. And that's where we get into the other issues. And people just throw up reaction against that language.
Well, and that gets so... the Friday feature tomorrow, earlier, Chris mentioned our Friday features. I'm going to be releasing an interview I did back on volume 108, I think in 2011, with Hans Boersma about the book Heavenly Participation. Great. Hans was at the time, I like to say, he was the J.I. Packer professor of theology. That gives him kind of street cred with Reformed people. But he's a patristic scholar, principally, and Gregory of Nyssa, I think, is the main area of interest. Yeah. And so, one of the things that book summarizes a lot of 20th century research, mostly by Roman Catholic theologians, most of whom were recovering Orthodox, the work of Eastern theologians. Yeah. Long pre-Reformation, pre-medieval. And basically recovering lost concerns about the relationship between God and creation.
So folks out there in podcast land, we're having some technical difficulties today, and according to Ken, maybe it's the ghost of Charles Hodge that's haunting us. but why don't you finish your thought there, Ken? And we'll. Oh no.
Yeah, so Marshall Audio was launched because I was trying to understand what is particularly problematic about the culture of modernity. And what I learned years into the process is that the theology of creation changes radically sometime late Middle Ages, early modern period, both Protestant and then Catholic theology of creation. And that unless we really examine that theology of creation, well, obviously we don't have time to go into that today, that way of understanding, particularly the relationship between God and creation, unless we revise that and recover an understanding that had basically been lost or denied, that I think we're going to continue to have stresses and strains and abnormalities of all sorts. And so that's something I didn't anticipate when I went into this, because I thought, well, we all have a doctrine of creation and we know God created everything, and that's all it says. But actually there's quite a bit more to understand. One way of summarizing it really quickly, what is in view when St. Paul says, at Mars Hill, in him we live and move and have our being? Right. What kind of metaphysical understanding of the relationship between God and creation is implied in that, and how did the church understand that for centuries until the early modern periods? So I think that a lot of the perplexities that we encounter within modernity are better understood when we have a richer understanding of a theology of creation. Unfortunately, that requires exercising some philosophical muscles that most of us just aren't used to exercising. Right. And so that's one of the reasons why our circulation has declined over the last 10 years, Mars Hill Audio, because I've decided if these are the questions that need to be asked, even though there's maybe not as big an audience that's already asking those questions, these are the questions that do need to be asked. And so that's one of the big things that I've learned in the course of 30 years of doing this.
Well, I'm disappointed that the circulation has declined, because I think that the need is greater than ever. And one of the things that I'm hoping that this, podcast can do for you today is, build that subscriber base, because the people who listen to us, I'm absolutely confident will love your show.
Well, thank you.
If they're not aware of it already, and we get tons of feedback from lay people who are, just delighted to be introduced to some things that they just don't get on in church or in Sunday school or what have you. We don't spend any time trying to make the local church and its ministries look bad or anything. We just dive into stuff and ideas and the very things that we're talking about right now. Well, let's kind of wrap things up. Is there anything you want to say just as we do so, Ken? Kind of a last thought for
just
us?
one provocative, open another provocative can of worms. And this is maybe something you can think about interviewing someone else. If you've listened a lot, you know that I really value the work of Oliver O'Donovan, who's a radically underappreciated moral philosopher of our time. He gave the Gifford Lectures this past year. And one of the things I've learned, he writes a lot work in ethics generally, and particularly in political theology. Did work in medical ethics early on also. But one of the things that I've learned from him in thinking about, we're going through an incredibly weird time politically, and have for years. And I actually had an email exchange with him back in 2016 about some things that I thought were kind of strange. And he reinforced in the email something that he's written in his book, and that is that that within modern framework of understanding, the very idea of political authority is no longer morally intelligible. And so we're having a lot of struggles. There are a lot of people like my friend Rod Dreher concerned about soft totalitarianism, a lot of people concerned about the overweening state. I've been more concerned in my adulthood with anarchy than tyranny, or with the possibility of anarchy inviting tyranny. And that's because I think that that modernity gives us a false understanding of what freedom is. It also gives us a false understanding of what authority is. And so I think that the one of the great challenges for the church is to bear witness to the idea that authority is a good thing.
Right.
There are a lot of people who are nervous about the abuse of authority. Of course, the abuse of authority is a bad thing, but authority as such is a good thing. And I'm concerned that that churches are not reflecting enough on why is it, what are the reasons why authority has come to be treated with such suspicion within modernity, and then how do we bear witness to the fact that that earthly authorities in some way represent God's own authority, not infallibly, but fathers and kings clearly image in some way the fatherhood of God and the kingship of Christ. So how do we speak that word to a society that's first of all tied to an essentially anarchic view that every individual should be free to do what they want to, and we're going to build up a powerful state that will impose that freedom on everybody.
Right.
So that's again, in terms of the subject matter that I've become really interested in, and there are theological. This isn't just a sociological, a sociologically understood problem. I think there's a lot of theology involved here as well.
Oh yeah, I think that's foundational. That's great. Well, Ken, we've had some gremlins from Princeton Theological Seminary who have been working against us to make this a challenging show to produce. But we've got a lot of material. But I just want to, as we wrap up, really encourage folks to do what I suggested earlier. Go and get your smartphone and go to the App Store and get Mars Hill Audio Journal and download it. And just make it, a habit of listening to the Free Friday feature. And my prediction is that if you do that, you will become a subscriber to Mars Hill Audio. And there are a lot of other things that Mars Hill Audio produces that are really great. There are extended interviews that are available through the app. There are audio books and things of that nature.
And I promise that your library will grow. Because I think I've ordered more books after listening to your show and discussing them on here. So there is kind of a relationship to the show.
I've been told I have the gift of bibliography, so that's...
Well, and really over the years, I would say your show, First Things and Touchstone, have been the lifeline for me, or lifelines for me, as a theologically conservative person who has got kind of an interest in, sort of a wide range of topics and wants to see sort of the connections and how my Christian faith relates to all of these larger cultural developments and so forth. So it's been great, Ken. Thank you for all your work.
Thank you, Chris. And Tom, good to be with you.
Good to be with you. Great having you.
Yeah. And if you would like to support the Theology Pugcast, you can do that through Patreon and in other ways. But it's great to have you with us, and thank you for listening. And we'll be in touch and talk to you next time.
Take care.
All right. Thanks a lot, Ken. Bye-bye.